Hello, wild wanderers, feral friends, and fellow nature nerds. As we head into the dog days of summer and careen rapidly towards fall, there's one thing that we have here in Wyoming, and I'm sure a lot of other places have them too, in abundance. And I'm talking about grasshoppers. Now, grasshoppers are one of those insects that are so common we tend to not give them much thought. They're just kind of there, part of the background of summer, like puffy white clouds and the smell of sunblock. But how much do you really know about grasshoppers? Well, let's get into the weeds, metaphorically speaking, and somewhat literally too, and take a look at a bug that never skips leg day, the lowly grasshopper. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. Now, it's no wonder we take grasshoppers for granted. They've been around a long time. They're one of the most ancient living groups of chewing herbivorous insects, dating back, about 250 million years. And because of that, as you might expect from one of the oldest living groups of insects, there's over 11,000 species of grasshopper, and they're found on every continent except Antarctica. Not a lot of grass in Antarctica. Now, since they're so common, you probably have a pretty good image in your head of what I'm talking about. And while they come in a variety of sizes and colors, for the most part, they look fairly similar. A long, thin body, a big head with short antennae and big compound eyes. Most species have wings, and of course, their most obvious feature, those big, beautiful back legs that make them excellent jumpers. But let's take an even closer look. We'll start at the head and we'll work our way down. On the side of a grasshopper's head are a pair of great big compound eyes. Now these eyes give them a broad field of vision, and they can detect movement, shape, color, and distance. Ever notice how it can be hard to get close to a grasshopper before it takes off? Well, those eyes are a big part of the reason why. And not only that, but they also have three simple eyes on their forehead, which can detect light intensity, like the shadow of a bird passing overhead. Also found on the head are the antennae, which contain both smell and touch receptors, and of course the head is where the grasshopper's mouth and its associated taste buds are located. Now you might have noticed that I didn't say anything about ears, and that's because there are no ears on the grasshopper's head. The tympanal organs, which is what grasshoppers and other insects use to detect sound, are located near the front of the abdomen, so it'd be kind of like having your ears down around your waist. But it turns out grasshoppers have sensory structures all over the place. Fine hairs called setae cover their body, although they're densest at the antenna, mouth, and tip of the abdomen. These hairs are mechanoreceptors that can detect touch and wind. Sensory structures in the legs detect pressure, and others in the joints of the exoskeleton detect position and movement. Now, between the head and the abdomen is the thorax, and that's where the grasshopper's two pairs of wings, assuming they have them, and three pairs of legs are attached. The forewings, known as tegmina, are narrow and leathery, while the hind wings are large and membranous. Grasshoppers' legs end in small claws for gripping, great for holding on to plants. The hind legs, of course, are the big ones, evolved for jumping. Grasshoppers jump to move from one place to another, to escape predators, and also to take flight. So unlike other insects, like for instance a ladybug that opens its wings and takes off, a grasshopper jumps first. Then, when it's in midair, it opens its wings and takes flight. A large grasshopper can jump about 4 feet, about a meter or roughly 20 times its own body length, without using its wings. The acceleration peaks at about 20 Gs. That's 20 times the force of gravity. I mean, sure, it's just for a split second, but to put that in perspective, an astronaut blasting into space experiences about 3 Gs. A fighter jet pilot might go as high as 9, and it's generally thought that a human couldn't survive anything over 18 Gs. So that's a powerful jump. Now, when in flight, many grasshoppers, especially the larger ones, make a clicking noise. Most grasshoppers also make noise by rubbing a row of pegs on the hind legs against the edges of the forewings, which, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you know that this is called stridulation. Stridulation is done mainly by males as a way to attract females, but in some species, the females also stridulate. Now, the abdomen, in addition to having the tympanal organs, contains the reproductive organs, including the chisel-shaped ovipositor of the females. So let's talk life cycle. Unlike butterflies and moths that undergo complete metamorphosis, grasshoppers undergo what's called incomplete metamorphosis. After mating, females of most species dig a hole using that chisel-shaped ovipositor and lay a batch of eggs in the ground near food plants, generally in the summer. After laying the eggs, she covers the hole with soil and leaf litter. In temperate climates, after a few weeks, the eggs of most species go into diapause and pass the winter in this state. Development will resume when the ground warms up above a certain threshold temperature in the spring. All the embryos in a pod generally hatch within a few minutes of each other. These first instar nymphs look almost like tiny adults, and they're able to jump away from predators even at this stage. Grasshopper nymphs pass through several instar stages. With each molt, they become bigger and more like an adult, with the wing buds increasing in size at each stage. The number of instars varies between species, but it's usually about 6. So after the final molt, the wings are inflated and they become fully functional. Average lifespan is about a year in warmer climates, shorter in cold areas since the adults don't overwinter. Now, most grasshopper species are what's called polyphagous, which is a fancy way of saying they're not picky about what they'll eat a bunch of different plants. Although there are some species that are more omnivorous and they'll eat animal tissue and animal feces. In general, though, they prefer grasses, including many cereals grown as crops, which can become a problem for reasons I'll talk about a little later. Now, it's tough to be a grasshopper because at every stage of your life, there's something that's more than happy to eat you. Eggs are eaten by bee flies and several species of beetle. Eggs and nymphs are also under attack by parasitoid flies who lay their eggs on them so their larvae can eat them. Nymphs and adults are preyed on by other insects, including ants, robber flies, wasps, and spiders. Not to mention every bird and small mammal from mice to foxes in the neighborhood. Now, one of the most fascinating parasites of grasshoppers is the grasshopper nematode, sometimes called a horsehair worm, because, well, that's what they look like. I talked about these once before, but let's review, shall we? Adult worms lay eggs on plants, and the host insect, in this case a grasshopper, gets infected when it eats the plant with the eggs on it. The worms hatch and grow inside the grasshopper's body, and when they reach adulthood, the parasite compels the grasshopper to, just go ahead and hop itself into a nearby body of water, where it subsequently drowns, allowing the worm to pop out and continue on to the next stage of its life cycle, which happens to take place in the water. Kind of brutal, but kind of cool in an Aliens meets The Last of Us kind of way. Now, on a bit of a side note, we humans are not exempt from grasshopper consumption either. Grasshoppers are regularly eaten in countries around the world, including Mexico, Japan, China, Uganda, and Indonesia. Indigenous people living in what's now coastal Northern California used to collect grasshoppers as a food source. Even the Bible mentions the use of grasshoppers as food. John the Baptist is described as surviving in the wilderness by eating wild honey and grasshoppers. More recently, with the search for alternative protein sources that are both healthy and sustainable, commercial companies started to operate grasshopper farms for potential use as food and protein supplements. I mean, technically they're grasshopper ranches, but I digress. And then there's diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, and fungi. Really, it's a wonder any grasshoppers survive long enough to reproduce. But they didn't survive for 250 million years without having a few survival hacks up their little grasshopper sleeves. First and foremost is camouflage. They can't eat you if they don't see you. A lot of grasshoppers are primarily green, tan, or brown in color, which blends in with the vegetation where they live. Some species can even change color to better suit their surroundings, kind of like a chameleon. And some mimic leaves or sticks, not just in color, but in body shape too. And just for the record, this is called being cryptic. But if they do see you, escape is always an option. To help with that, grasshoppers often use a startle display, bright colors and patterns that can only be seen when they're flying, which hopefully startles a predator just long enough to escape by employing those excellent jumping and flying skills. And then there are species that are, drumroll please, aposematic. Come on now, I've talked about aposematism several times, including the last 2 episodes. Bright colors, rather than cryptic colors, that advertise to predators that they're toxic and likely to taste bad. Now, since grasshoppers eat a lot of plant matter, both as adults and, as my cousin Vinny would say, when they're utes, they can be serious pests, especially in arid lands and prairies. Grasshoppers like to bask in the sun, and they thrive in warm, sunny conditions. So drought conditions actually stimulate an increase in grasshopper populations. Now, a single season of drought is not usually enough to stimulate a major population increase, but several successive dry seasons, well, that's a different story, especially if the intervening winters are mild, which contributes to large numbers of nymphs surviving. Can you say climate change? Fortunately, there are some easy ways to prevent them from becoming problematic. Shade, like from trees, will discourage them, and they might be prevented from moving on to developing crops by removing coarse vegetation from fallow land and field margins and discouraging thick growth in ditches and along roadsides. So, mowing. Not my favorite thing, but better than a poke in the nose, as my grandma used to say, or in this case, pesticides. But then there are locusts. Now, sometimes cicadas are mistaken for locusts, and it's not really surprising since cicadas are big, weird-looking bugs who sometimes emerge in large numbers. And when I was a kid, that's what I thought. I didn't associate the sound of cicadas buzzing in the trees with the great big weird bug I might find later on at the end of its life cycle. But while cicadas eat little or nothing as adults, maybe just suck on some plant juices, locusts, on the other hand, eat a lot. So you might be wondering, what's the difference between a grasshopper and a locust? And the answer is nothing. Locusts are grasshoppers, but they're grasshoppers of certain species that under certain circumstances swarm and cause chaos, like college students on spring break. Swarming is a response to overcrowding. The transformation from a solitary individual into a swarming one is triggered by several contacts per minute over a short period of time. Increased tactile stimulation of the hind legs causes an increase in serotonin. In humans, serotonin is a chemical in the brain that's involved in a bunch of stuff like mood and learning and memory and rewards. In the right species of grasshopper, it causes them to change color, feed more, and breed faster. Following this transformation, under suitable conditions, dense nomadic bands of flightless nymphs, known as hoppers, can occur. Now, these outlaw gangs of locusts produce pheromones that attract more locusts. With several generations in a year, the locust population can quickly grow from a localized group into a vast accumulation of flying adults, suitably known as a plague, which devour all the vegetation that they encounter. Now, plagues of locusts have been recorded since, well, pretty much since history started getting recorded. The ancient Egyptians had hieroglyphs depicting locusts found carved into tombs dating back to 2470 to 2200 BC. Locust plagues are mentioned in the Iliad, the Quran, the Bible, and Hindu texts. The Roman historian Livy recorded a locust plague in 203 BC and mentioned human epidemics following it. A pestilence in the northwestern provinces of China in 311 AD killed 98% of the local population and was blamed on locusts. Now, in both of these last 2 cases, the deaths were probably not directly related to the locusts themselves, but to an increase in rats that showed up to eat the locust carcasses, and more specifically, the fleas on the rats. Bubonic plague, anyone? It's little wonder that people thought plagues of locusts were sent by angry gods as a punishment for some unknown transgression. But the largest locust swarm ever recorded was one formed by a species called the Rocky Mountain locust in 1874. Estimates put the number of insects at somewhere between 3.5 trillion and 12.5 trillion, which is a wide range, but it ranks as the greatest concentration of animals ever speculatively guessed, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. The locusts swarmed over an estimated 2 million square miles, or 5.2 million square kilometers, encompassing the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Iowa, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, and Texas. The plague also reached Canada's Northwest Territories and Manitoba. Residents at the time described swarms so thick they covered the sun for up to 6 hours. The arriving locusts would pile up over a foot high and ate the crops, the leaves off the trees, grass, wool straight off the sheep, harnesses on horses, paint off the wagons, and pitchfork handles. Not even food inside houses was safe, nor was clothing and carpet. Locust excrement and carcasses polluted ponds, streams, and wells, and cattle and horses refused to drink from these tainted sources. Even chicken and turkeys became inedible. The birds were happy to eat the grasshoppers, but the meat and eggs became stained with a reddish-brown oil. Trains had trouble getting traction because the rails were slick with locust guts. Nebraska historian Addison E. Sheldon described the scene like this. On a clear, hot July day, a haze came over the sun. The haze deepened into a gray cloud. Suddenly, the cloud resolved itself into billions of gray grasshoppers sweeping down upon the earth. The vibration of their wings filled the ear with a roaring sound like a rushing storm. As far as the eye could reach in every direction, the air was filled with them. Where they alighted, they covered the ground like a heavy, crawling carpet. Now, farmers tried several methods to fight the swarm, but were largely unsuccessful just because of the sheer volume of insects. The swarm would eat for several days and then move on as suddenly as it arrived. As one farmer put it, they left nothing but the mortgage. So why haven't we seen a swarm like this in the United States since then? Well, it helps that the species of locust responsible, the Rocky Mountain locust, is now extinct. The last specimen was seen alive in Canada in 1902. Recent research suggests that their breeding grounds, which were in the valleys of the Rocky Mountains, came under sustained agricultural development during the gold rush era in the 1880s and 1890s, destroying all of their underground eggs. And that's where we'll end this episode. I hope you enjoyed learning more about our grass-hopping friends. If anyone has eaten grasshoppers, and I don't just mean like the novelty chocolate-covered kind, but like a real grasshopper recipe, drop me a line and let me know. I'm curious to hear how it was. Now, if you want to help me out, there's some ways you can do that. Consider becoming a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month. That's less than lunch at a fast food place that's probably not making their burgers with grasshoppers yet. You can find all the information at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. You can make a one-time donation through PayPal or send me an email using the same address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. And I would love it if you bought some merch. There's all kinds of stuff to be had with the awesome Dispatches from the Forest logo on it. Check it out at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest, and then click on products. For additional content, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.